And you need to do this early. You can't just do that when you have the Alzheimer's disease, because the damage in your brain begins 20 to 30 years before you see any issues in the brain. And lastly, before we move on, 80% of people with Alzheimer's disease have insulin resistance. 80% of people with memory issues, with emotional disturbances, etc., with personality changes, have type 2 diabetes. 80%. Let that sink in. I've worked and still work with a world-leading expert, Professor Christian Holscher, who uses diabetes drugs that are known as GLP-1 analogs, so synthetic analogs of the gut hormone GLP-1, to treat memory loss in Alzheimer's disease. And I learned something cool. Now, did you know that diabetes is one of the biggest known risk factors for dementia? And did you know that Alzheimer's disease is also known as type 3 diabetes? And because of this, it's actually no surprise that your metabolic health, which means the amount of body fat that you carry, the present and absence of insulin resistance, as well as elevated blood sugar levels, hyperglycaemia, so those three things predict your brain health. Now, this YouTube channel is all about neuroscience and high performance. And for me personally, high performance means to be extremely successful in your chosen profession, to have strong relationships, to have time to enjoy yourself, and to have incredible health. Now, in particular, let me point out that your brain is probably the most precious organ in your entire body. Your brain moves your muscles, including your heart. It stores all of your memories. It decides how you perceive the world. And your brain is the reason why your current life is either great or horrible. So therefore, in today's video, I will explain the neuroscience as to why obesity and its related conditions, insulin resistance and hyperglycemia, lead to brain damage and poorer cognitive function. Moreover, I will give you 3 actionable tips you can apply to optimize both your metabolic and brain health for a fit body and an even sharper mind that are both worthy of a high performer. Now, if you're excited, please take a moment to smash those like and subscribe buttons so that we can grow the channel and build an army of high performance and neuroscience enthusiasts together. I would highly appreciate it. That said, my name is Nicholas. I'm a neuroscientist, dementia researcher, as well as a high performance and flow coach, and this is how to optimize your metabolic and brain health to prevent Alzheimer's disease or type 3 diabetes. Now, to open up the video, let's talk a little bit about body weight. Now, I put down a brain scan, or generally a few brain images here, and what you will see is the more body weight you carry, BMI, I will talk about how it's calculated in a moment. So once again, if you're overweight, if you're obese, the more body weight you carry, the less brain mass you actually have. Reason for that in a moment. In any case, there's also another thing that you need to know, and that's the fact that if you have an obese mother, then you can literally alter the gene expression in your child. Now, we call this epigenetics because every single cell in our body has the same DNA. However, only parts of the DNA are actually expressed. It makes sense because a skin cell, for example, obviously doesn't need the same genes as a brain cell would have. Now, in this case, again, if you have an obese mother, it can alter the gene expression in the child in a way that this child is more prone to develop depression, more prone to develop anxiety. This child even has lower cognitive performance. Let that sink in. And that's just because the mother was obese. And there are also some other potential negative effects, such as ADHD, etc. These are not clear, however, and I will not go into detail here. Now, that said, let's talk about obesity and its related conditions, because obesity, of course, also increases your risk to develop diabetes, hyperglycemia, etc. Now, first and foremost, what you need to know is that midlife overweight means that your BMI is above 25, increases your Alzheimer's risk by 34 to 35%, as is proven in different meta-analyses. So meta-analysis means that an author pretty much looked at every single study that was out there. So it looked at hundreds of studies, millions of participants. And again, it was figured out that being overweight, slightly at least, increases your Alzheimer's risk massively. Now, the calculation of the BMI will pretty much be your weight in kilograms divided by your height in square meters. I put the formula down here for you. However, you don't need to calculate that yourself. Just Google an online calculator, plug in your weight, and you should be able to figure out your own BMI. As a word of caution, however, the BMI does not differentiate between body weight and muscle mass, meaning that a bodybuilder, for example, a bodybuilder usually has a lot of muscle mass, of course, and very low body fat. Those people tend to have high BMIs as well, so keep that in mind. Problematic is actually body fat, it's not muscle mass per se, but it works quite well for the general population. So once again, just use one of those online calculators to see where you are. And what you also need to know is that being overweight, so having a BMI above 25, increases your diabetes risk massively. So your risk of diabetes is 3 times higher. And especially problematic is here belly fat, visceral fat as we call it. So that's one of the main reasons why you develop diabetes in the first place. Other than that, if you go beyond that, if you're not just overweight, but if you're obese, as is very common in the USA, for example, but also of course in other areas of the world, then your risk to develop the stage before Alzheimer's, mild cognitive impairment, increased by 21%. And that is actually quite scary. Your risk to develop Alzheimer's if you're obese is almost doubled. It increased by 91 to 96%. And even worse, your risk to develop vascular dementia, in which blood vessels are damaged, and you develop dementia as a consequence of that. Your risk of vascular dementia increased by 148%. Why that is, in a moment, because obesity has quite negative effects on your blood vessels. In any case, there are a few pretty cool studies that I want to point out. One of them showed that each BMI unit, so each BMI point, accelerates Alzheimer's disease, development of Alzheimer's disease and memory loss, etc. by 6.7 months. Alright? Other than that, each centimeter of your waist, so belly fat basically, each centimeter you gain reduces your brain blood flow by 1 year of biological aging. And of course, I have to point out that obesity, diabetes, and hyperglycemia, even though they are linked, they all individually. So it doesn't matter which one you have. If you have one of them, or even worse, if you have all of them, it's shown in studies that reduces your cognitive function. So if you score someone on attention, how fast their reaction time is, etc., it's lower if you're obese, it's lower if you have hyperglycemia, it's lower if you have diabetes. And of course, it also reduces your memory function. And this is even in non-dement individuals. So even people that are healthy see the negative effects, again, of obesity, diabetes, and having high blood glucose levels. Now, that brings us to the question, what should you actually look at? So what parameters can you look at to check whether you are actually at a risk to develop Alzheimer's or not? So I put down 4 variables that you can check with your doctor. So just get a blood work, get your blood work done, or use other services such as Inside Tracker, for example. In any case, what you should look at is, of course, first the glucose tolerance test. That's sometimes done, and in this case, you have to ingest 75 grams of glucose. So you just eat some sugar, basically, and then they measure the glucose levels that you have in your bloodstream 2 hours later. And this makes sense because if you're diabetic, then it means that the insulin in your body is not working properly anymore. And if the insulin is not working anymore, the insulin cannot carry the glucose in your bloodstream into your muscle cells, into your fat cells, into your liver, etc. anymore. So your blood sugar levels stay higher after those 2 hours. And I put down some diabetic and importantly pre-diabetic ranges for you. So pre-diabetic would be 7.8 to 11 millimole per liter. You don't need to remember that, but if you have your blood work, you can compare to these values. And ideally, you don't want to be diabetic, absolutely not. And you absolutely also don't want to be pre-diabetic, because pre-diabetic ranges already have negative effects on your brain health. So avoid these. Other tests would be fasting glucose levels. As the name suggests, how high your blood glucose levels are when you don't eat any food. There are the ranges. Then, of course, you have HOMA IR. So that is pretty much directly assessing whether you have insulin resistance, and it pretty much reflects how high your fasting blood glucose levels are compared to how high your fasting insulin levels are. And in this case, you want to have a value below 1. And lastly, there's actually my favorite value, and that is HbA1c. Also my favorite because there are many links to Alzheimer's and dementia. Now, what this value actually is your red blood cells, erythrocytes as they are called. And more precisely, it looks at how much of your red blood cells were modified by glucose. Because what you need to know is that the higher your glucose levels are, the more opportunities there are for the glucose to react with proteins in your bloodstream, to react with cells, to add a little sugar group to them. So again, high glucose levels, higher blood sugar levels means that you get more sugar modifications of your proteins, once again, more sugar modifications of other cells in your body, and that includes, of course, red blood cells. And what you need to know is that how many modified or blood sugar modified red blood cells you have, it pretty much reflects the last 8 to 12 weeks. And that's because the average lifespan of a blood cell is 117 days in men and a little less, 106 days in women. So of course, if your red blood cells were exposed to very high glucose levels in your bloodstream, so if you were diabetic for the last 8 to 12 weeks, then of course you have higher levels of these glucose modified erythrocytes. And there's very good evidence here to suggest that you should most definitely keep your HbA1c level between 6.5%. So keep it below the diabetic range at all costs. Now, importantly, again, obesity encourages prediabetes. Obesity encourages diabetes, so development of insulin resistance, and both damage the brain massively. So at all costs, keep your BMI below 25. In particular, keep your body fat low, and also avoid the pre-diabetic and diabetic ranges that I put down for you here. And you need to do this early. You can't just do that when you have the Alzheimer's disease, because the damage in your brain begins 20 to 30 years before you see any issues in the brain. And that is why it's so extremely important that you get your blood values, you get your body weight, etc. right in your midlife, between age 35 to 55. And lastly, before we move on, 80% of people with Alzheimer's disease have insulin resistance. 80% of people with memory issues, with emotional disturbances, etc., with personality changes, have type 2 diabetes. 80%. Let that sink in. Now, why is that? Now we go into mechanisms a little bit. Now, hang with me, because this will give you an understanding of what is actually going on. And if you understand it, of course, you can make adjustments in your lifestyle to counter these things. First and foremost, I want to go into the fact that how do you actually create an Alzheimer mouse? How do we do that in the lab? And the easiest way to do that is to just make those mice fat. Literally, you just feed them a high-fat diet. Just mix a lot of oil basically into their food, give them highly palatable food. So in real life, you would just take someone and let them eat fast food every single day. The point being is that these mice then, of course, as they gain a lot of weight, they develop diabetes and they develop memory issues. And what is very striking is the fact that the memory damage or the brain damage that is done is extremely similar to Alzheimer's. It might even be exactly the same. And in fact, it is exactly the same damage. Now, let's look into the mechanisms. So what is actually happening? First and foremost, obesity creates background inflammation in your entire body, because all of the fatty acids that are circulating in your bloodstream, those are inflammatory. So the cholesterol and all of the other stuff that's circulating around. Then adipose tissue, so the fat tissue itself, especially your belly fat tissue, that produce a lot of molecules, etc., that are also inflammatory in your body. And you have your macrophages are activated, so macrophages are immune cells, and that is because there's a lot of blood vessel damage done Your immune cells recognize that, bind to your blood vessels, and then they produce a lot more of these pro-inflammatory cytokines, TNF-alpha, interleukin-1, etc. And you don't need to know that in particular, just know that it causes inflammation in your entire body if you get more fat. And the main point here really is that this inflammation then creates insulin resistance. So it's not the fat itself, but it's the inflammation that's caused by the body fat that then leads to insulin resistance in your liver, in your fat tissue itself, in fact, and even in muscle cells. Then the consequence of insulin resistance is, of course, that insulin doesn't work anymore. And that is when, of course, the sugar, the blood sugar, cannot be removed anymore. It cannot be carried into your muscle cells, your liver cells, your fat cells anymore. So you have higher blood sugar levels. And those higher blood sugar levels then create oxidative stress. They modify your proteins in your body. They modify your red blood cells, etc. And all of that ultimately also leads to blood vessel damage. The oxidative stress damages your blood vessels. Then you have the problem that you have cholesterol circulating around, again, which can deposit in your blood vessels. That can actually reduce blood flow. Then you might develop hypertension. That is, of course, because your blood vessels clog up. And if they clog up, then bloodstream, of course, is reduced, and your body has to push harder. Your heart has to increase blood pressure so that blood can actually still flow through. Ultimately, another problem is then that the oxidative stress and inflammation damage the blood-brain barrier. Now, blood-brain barrier, that is actually a wall of cells that separates the blood vessels in your brain from the brain, because the brain is, of course, a very sensitive organ that is. It has an exclusive environment, and you don't want all of the stuff that's floating around in your blood in the brain. That is why we have this barrier, blood-brain barrier. And as the blood-brain barrier is damaged, you get a lot of stuff into your brain that should not be there. And as you can imagine, that's probably not good. One of the things that actually does happen is that immune cells get entry into your brain, which is a big, big problem. In any case, what also happens is that the inflammation that you have in your entire body, those molecules, pro-inflammatory cytokines, they actually get into your brain to begin with. They can just pass through the blood-brain barrier, and then they cause inflammation in the brain. And when you have inflammation in the brain, guess what? You develop insulin resistance in the brain. Now, this has a lot of negative consequences. I will talk about that in a moment, so hang with me. We'll also get into tools in a second. But the consequence of insulin resistance in the brain is that you have plaque and tau tangle buildup, so develop those big clumps in your brain. Then, of course, you have the decreased blood flow. You have the inflammation in your brain. Your blood vessels are damaged. Of course, because your blood doesn't flow properly anymore. Nutrients are not delivered into your brain properly anymore. You have all of this stuff that's not supposed to be in your brain because the blood-brain barrier is damaged, which goes in. And all of that ultimately leads to damage. It damages your brain tissue. That's when you have gray matter loss. For example, in the prefrontal cortex, which is where you make logical decisions, or in the hippocampus, which is where long-term memories are formed. You might even develop mini strokes. Again, quite common actually if you're obese, and dementia, and if you have diabetes in particular. And ultimately, yes, you develop dementia. So that's when your cognition goes down. That's when your attention goes down. That's when your memory function goes down. It all happens again as you develop, as your brain cells die, as connections between your brain cells die, as you lose the synapses, which are the gaps between two brain cells where their connections meet, etc. Alright, now into the juicy part. It actually has been shown in 2005, basically, by Steen et al., so put down the publication here, that Alzheimer's patients had insulin resistance in their brain. So literally, these Alzheimer patients were looked at, so their brain tissue was looked at after the death, and it was very clear that the insulin receptors, they were blocked. They didn't work properly anymore. And that was the first time when this term was coined that Alzheimer's could actually be type 3 diabetes. And it's also very well known nowadays that this occurs even if you don't have diabetes. So you get insulin resistance in the brain, even if you don't have diabetes in the rest of your body, even if you don't have the typical diabetes. So again, Alzheimer's, in fact, is diabetes of the brain. That's why it's called type 3 diabetes. And this is a problem because insulin is very special in the brain, has a special function. And the rest of your body, insulin, again, just carries glucose into your muscle cells, into your fat cells, etc. However, in the brain, insulin actually is a growth factor. It protects your brain cells from damage. That's how they survive. It actually increases the glucose metabolism in your brain. So what this means is that insulin is what allows your brain cells to create energy. It's actually shown on the brain scan I have put down here. Of course, you lose brain mass as you during dementia in general. However, besides that, your glucose metabolism goes down. And this is again because of insulin resistance. And if your brain cells are not able to produce energy from glucose anymore, then you have a problem. And obviously, then you see all of these negative effects. That's when your memory function goes down. If your brain cells don't have energy anymore, they die more easily. Their synapses don't work properly anymore, etc. And again, insulin is actually also responsible for long-term memory formation. Insulin also has effects on your brain blood flow, meaning that insulin improves blood flow in the brain. So if insulin doesn't work in the brain anymore, then blood flow slows down, which is problematic, as we all know. And in fact, there was a study, or several studies in fact, where they literally delivered insulin with a nose spray into the brain, and this improved memory function. It improved cognition, even in Alzheimer's patients, but also in healthy volunteers and older adults. Now, I have to say that's actually a pretty stupid idea to give Alzheimer's patients insulin. Why? Because you develop insulin resistance in the brain, so insulin doesn't work anymore. And if you then give them insulin, what do you expect? But in those patients, it actually worked, probably because they were still at an early stage where insulin resistance didn't develop or hasn't fully developed yet, and they still were somewhat responsive to insulin. But the point being is that insulin has big effects in your brain. Now, here we are. Now we look into tools, everyone. So thank you for sticking with me. And this will be worth your time. It's actually very simple because you probably figured out what to do already. But the first thing is lose body fat. Most precisely, get your BMI below 25. And I have to break it to you. High body fat, if you're overweight or obese, but a healthy diet is more unhealthy than if you're lean with a crappy diet. So you can eat fast food all day. If you're lean, if you're skinny, you're probably okay. But if you're really fat, even though you eat a super healthy diet, that is a problem, unfortunately. Because as we now know, the body fat is the problem. The body fat is what causes inflammation in your brain, in your body, in your entire body. And this inflammation then again has many negative effects such as insulin resistance, damages your blood vessels, cholesterol deposits, etc. So again, just the best thing you can do to keep your brain in top shape is to just lose weight. And a few general tips include that you should have a daily calorie deficit of 300 to 500 calories. What matters is calories in versus calories out. So you can just use MyFitnessPal, for example, to check your food intake. Then, of course, you can increase your NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, meaning that is just the activity you do outside of actual training. An easy way would be to just aim for 10,000 steps a day to burn some energy and make it easier for you to lose weight. Then, of course, you should do cardio, also for brain functions, many benefits in general, improve blood flow, etc. But yeah, cardio, 3 times a week, ideally 30 to 60 minutes, helps you to lose weight. Of course, you have better cognitive function, improves mood, improves brain blood flow. Then, of course, as you probably know, use common sense, so you should prefer high volume, low calorie and filling foods, whole grains, vegetables, potatoes, also high protein, because higher protein helps you to stay satiated. And of course, avoid fast food for obvious reasons, because it has very low volume but high calories, and oftentimes a lot of salt and sugar, which stimulate appetite, and you don't want that if you want to lose weight. Also good, a very good one actually, is intermittent fasting and coffee, which can both decrease your appetite. More about fasting in a second. Resistance training, that is one of the best things we can do. And why is that? That is because insulin, 80% of the glucose in your bloodstream is actually carried into your skeletal muscles, meaning that the more muscle mass you have, the easier it is to get rid of the glucose in your bloodstream, so the less likely you are to develop hyperglycemia. On the other hand, of course, adipose tissue, so fat tissue, is actually what causes inflammation, what causes insulin resistance in the first place. So simply put, if you want to have good metabolic health, you want to have as much muscle mass as possible and as little body fat as possible. Then you have better blood glucose control and insulin works better. Now also the Exercise and Sports Science Australia recommends a minimum of 2 resistance training sessions per week. And ideally, of course, you add some cardio in for the benefits I mentioned earlier and to make weight loss easier. So you might add in 125 to 210 minutes of cardio a week. Again, just do it 3 times a week, 30 to 60 minutes approximately, and it should be fine. Interesting is, to give you the science, there was actually a study that looked at 32,000 men in 2012, and they found out that resistance training 2 to 3 times a week, 150 minutes approximately, led to a 34% reduction in diabetes risk. And even more so, if the BMI was extremely high, if those individuals were obese and they did resistance training, there was a 60% reduction in diabetes risk. So definitely make sure you do resistance training. Besides the fact that it obviously looks sharp, I mean, we all want to have more body. We all want to have that 6-pack and not only in our fridge, I suppose. And of course, that's one thing I have to mention. Muscle mass can increase your BMI, so keep that in mind. But what really matters is, again, body fat. You want to have as less body fat as possible and as much muscle as possible. And finally, fasting, also known as time-restricted eating, one of the healthiest things you can do, because the when you eat matters. And what you want to do is restrict your food intake to 8 to 12 hours. For example, you could start eating at 10 a.m. in the morning and you could stop eating at 6 p.m. in the evening. And ideally, you leave some space before you go to bed and you leave some space after you wake up so you don't eat, so that you can extend the fasting period. It is very well known that that boosts your organ health and even extends your lifespan. One of the very interesting studies were done by Pandas Group. For example, in 2012 and 14, Pandas Group showed that at least in animals, in rodents, if they were fasted, then they actually had a reduction in cholesterol, less fasting blood sugar levels. They actually lost body weight and body fat and had less inflammation. And that was despite the fact that they were given a high-fat diet and despite the fact that they ate exactly the same calories as other animals. The only difference was that those animals that were fasted, of course, only had access to food for 8 hours, whereas the other animals that had exactly the same calorie intake got the high-fat diet the entire day, so they had access to this food the entire day. And there's actually a really interesting study in humans as well, in 2017, that showed that generally, if you eat less often, so subjects that only ate 1 or 2 meals a day actually lost weight. They had an easier time, whereas those people who ate 3 times or more a day tend to gain weight. So it's just a general guideline, but it makes sense because if you just eat 1 meal, then it's really difficult for you to eat so much that you gain weight. Makes sense because you would have to stuff your face. And in particular, if you eat healthy, if you eat whole grains, beans, and all of these things, it's really hard to overeat. And it's a lot easier to lose weight if you eat less often. Generally spoken, the guidelines that I like in this study here were the fact that you should ideally eat breakfast and lunch 5 to 6 hours apart, so those 2 meals. And also, again, make your overnight fast very long, 18 hours maybe. So only have a short eating window of maybe 6 hours, which you consume breakfast and lunch. And ideally, you stop eating 2 to 3 hours before you go to bed, and you wait with eating at least 1 hour after you get up, so that you extend again this fasting period over sleep. And that concludes the video. So thank you for your time and attention. Now, in summary, to carry excess body fat in your midlife between age 35 and 55 is one of the unhealthiest things for your body and brain. A BMI above 25 and especially 30 results in increased inflammation from inflammatory lipids such as cholesterol, and your adipose tissue also produces inflammatory cytokines that then trigger insulin resistance, again in your body and brain. And insulin resistance, on the other hand, then leads to elevated blood glucose levels, hyperglycaemia, as well as oxidative stress and blood vessel damage. And finally, the negative consequences then reach the brain, where you see reduced brain blood flow. That is because of the damage in cholesterol clogged blood vessels, and you see mini strokes. And because insulin is an important growth factor in the brain that is involved in the survival, energy metabolism, and memory formation in neurons, insulin resistance means that the neurons in your brain cannot function properly anymore. And that might be the beginning of the end. So don't allow this to happen. Lose weight. Get your BMI below 25 now. Do resistance training at least twice a week to build muscle mass. And consider intermittent fasting by restricting yourself to an eating window of 8 hours a day. For example, only eat between 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Also, finally, if you're very ambitious and you want to reach the next level of physical and mental performance to accomplish your goals, even go beyond what you thought is possible, just shoot me an email at nicholas.peterreich@gmail.com for neuroscience-backed high performance and flow coaching. More information in the video description. That said, have a powerful week, high performers, and I will see you in the next video.